So usually when we try to figure out how wealthy a country actually is, we treat it like we're checking a massive national bank account, right?
Right. You just look at the bottom line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You look at the gross domestic product, the GDP,
Right.
and you see this number with like 12 or 13 zeros at the end. The economic commentators point to the soaring graph, and the consensus is just really simple. The line is going up, they're building skyscrapers, there are luxury cars on the street, so, I mean, the country must be rich.
It's a very seductive narrative. Yeah. We have this collective bias toward really visible, tangible metrics of success.
Yeah, for sure.
Like if a nation's pouring concrete and exporting millions of barrels of this highly demanded commodity, the assumption is just, well, the underlying economic engine has to be healthy. We essentially equate the sheer volume of cash changing hands with actual sustainable prosperity.
But then you step out of the headline news, right? And you dive into the deep, honestly kind of murky waters of macroeconomics, natural resources, demographic shifts, and suddenly that simple bank statement starts looking like a highly sophisticated illusion.
An illusion is the perfect word for it.
And that's exactly what we're looking at today. For everyone listening, we've curated this massive stack of data for today's deep dive. We're pulling from this comprehensive database of World Bank indicators, detailed national accounts, and macro-level population data.
It's a very dense stack.
Oh, it's incredibly dense.
Yeah.
But the mission here is to trace the economic trajectory of Saudi Arabia. And what we found completely shatters those standard assumptions about wealth. We are talking about this mind-bending paradox where during periods when the whole world viewed this country as an unstoppable economic juggernaut, its actual, real national wealth was in a state of steep decline.
Yeah, it's a huge paradox. And it's the perfect entry point into understanding how nations actually survive in the long term, right?
Hmm.
It forces us, and you as the listener, to separate the illusion of cash flow from the reality of asset management.
Let's just jump straight into the hook here, the data point that completely exposes this illusion. There is this metric in the macroeconomic world called adjusted net savings. And for a nation that most people consider, one of the wealthiest on the planet, this metric didn't just experience a mild dip.
No, it completely crashed.
Right. At certain historical low points, it plummeted into the red, hitting an astonishing negative 8.08%.
Wow.
Yeah, and it often
Yeah.
hovered in that negative 3.26% range of their gross national income. I mean, to a layman, negative savings in a booming petrostate sounds like a typo in the spreadsheet.
It really does. But
Yeah.
to grasp the gravity of a negative 8% savings rate, we first have to understand the fundamental blind spot of traditional GDP.
Okay, break that down for us.
So GDP measures the speed and the volume of money moving through an economy over a specific time, right? It's
Right.
basically a speedometer. But a speedometer doesn't tell you how much gas is actually left in the tank.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, GDP completely ignores the depletion of natural capital. It treats the liquidation of a finite, irreplaceable asset as pure, unadulterated income. Adjusted net savings, on the other hand, is an attempt to measure the true rate of wealth accumulation.
So it's looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. It starts with your gross national savings, money left over after consumption, but then it starts making deductions. It subtracts the value of depleted natural resources, like pumping oil out of the ground. It subtracts the calculated cost of environmental damage and pollution. And then, on the positive side, it adds investments in human capital, like education.
Okay, I want to make sure I am really wrapping my head around the sheer scale of this illusion because the implications for the data are massive. Let's imagine you inherit a multi-million-dollar trust fund from your grandparents.
Okay, nice scenario.
Right. You immediately liquidate all the stocks, you sell off the real estate, and you use all that cash to buy a fleet of luxury yachts. You host these massive parties, hire a huge staff.
Living the dream.
Exactly. And if someone only looks at your cash flow or your personal GDP for that year, you look like a financial titan.
Yeah.
Money is just moving everywhere.
Right.
But your actual long-term wealth is dropping to zero because you aren't producing any new value. You are literally just burning through your inheritance. Is that exactly what we are seeing here with this negative savings rate?
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly.
Yes.
You are confusing the liquidation of an asset with the generation of sustainable income. When a nation pumps a barrel of oil from beneath the desert and sells it on the global market, the GDP registers a win. The nation's income goes up.
Because cash came in.
Exactly. But the adjusted net savings metric acts as the the sober accountant in the room, noting that the country is now permanently 1 barrel of oil poorer. That geologic asset has left the balance sheet forever. So when those savings rates dropped into the negatives, the underlying data was screaming a warning.
Meaning what exactly?
It meant that the value of the resources they were consuming and destroying was entirely offsetting the economic growth they were reporting. They were literally spending their geological trust fund just to keep the lights on and the parties going.
Wow. Which means they were on a complete collision course with reality.
Precisely.
And that sets up the overarching narrative we're exploring today. This data tells the story of a highly centralized state in a desperate existential race against time. They are attempting to pull off one of the most complex maneuvers in modern economic history.
It really is.
They're trying to transform an entire societal model from extracting wealth from the ground to cultivating wealth in the mind.
And the friction of that transition is immense. Changing an economic model means rewiring the social contract of millions of people. It's not just policy, it's culture.
Right. And to understand why they are pushing so hard for this transformation right now, we have to look at the sheer size of the trust fund they were draining. When you dig into the national accounts data regarding mineral and energy consumption, the numbers are, well, they're difficult to process.
They are staggering.
We are looking at historical periods where the depletion of mineral and energy resources accounted for over 50% of their entire gross national income.
Over half.
Yes, specifically, energy depletion alone hit peaks of 41.7%. And when you combine that with other mineral resources, it peaked at over 51.3%. Well over half of the national income derived from permanently removing non-renewable assets.
Just consider the extreme vulnerability of that position for a moment. Earning half of your national income by permanently liquidating your foundation is a really precarious way to run a country. First, you are entirely at the mercy of global commodity markets.
Because if the price drops.
Exactly. If the price of crude drops, your national income collapses, but your domestic spending obligations, they remain exactly the same. Second, and honestly more importantly, the clock is always ticking. The negative adjusted net savings rates were a blaring alarm bell, but it is very easy to ignore an alarm bell when the immediate surroundings look so prosperous.
Right. If everyone has a job and the streets are paved with gold, who cares about the accountant?
Exactly. When you are building massive infrastructure projects, funding really generous public sector jobs, and heavily subsidizing daily life, the illusion of infinite wealth completely takes hold.
It creates a psychological trap, doesn't it? Like, if the money is flowing today, it's nearly impossible to convince people to worry about 30 years from now.
Yes, that psychological trap is known in economics as the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty. The abundance of a highly valuable, easily extractable resource often just stunts the development of other economic sectors.
Because why bother?
Right. Why go through the painful, decades-long process of building a competitive manufacturing sector or a complex tax system when you can simply drill another hole in the ground? For a long time, the global economic consensus treated resource-rich nations as if they had this magical, infinite revenue stream. The adjusted net savings data strips away that magic and reveals they were simply selling off the factory floor piece by piece.
And digging up and burning all that wealth didn't just drain the balance sheet, right? It generated a massive hidden environmental tab that was compounding year over year.
The environmental cost is huge.
The climate data embedded in these sources is incredibly stark. The total carbon dioxide emissions for the country skyrocketed from an early baseline of roughly 52 million tons to well over 275.7 million tons.
It's a massive jump.
And this wasn't just a byproduct of citizens, driving more cars. The emissions from industrial processes alone surged from about 6 million to nearly 86 million tons.
Those absolute numbers are striking, definitely. But we have to provide some nuance here. Absolute emissions naturally rise as any developing nation grows, urbanizes, and industrializes.
Sure, you're building cities.
Right. If you want to build a modern society in a harsh desert environment, you need cement for skyscrapers, you need steel for infrastructure, and massive amounts of energy for desalination plants just to provide drinking water. Cement production, for example, is inherently carbon-heavy, not just from the energy used, but from the chemical process of calcination itself.
So the absolute rise is somewhat expected.
Exactly. The truly alarming metric in this dataset, the one that indicates a systemic structural flaw in their economy, is the carbon intensity of their GDP.
Okay, let's break that concept down because carbon intensity can sound like abstract academic jargon to a lot of people.
Yeah.
What exactly does this measure and why is it such a red flag in the data?
Sure. So carbon intensity measures the economic fuel efficiency of a nation. Specifically, it calculates how many kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent are emitted for every single dollar of gross domestic product produced.
Carbon dioxide equivalent being.
Right. It's simply a way to measure all greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide based on their global warming potential and bundle them into one standard metric. So in simple terms, carbon intensity tells you how much pollution it costs to generate 1 unit of wealth.
Oh, I see. It's like measuring the miles per gallon of the entire economy.
That is a brilliant way to frame it, yes. And the data shows their economic miles per gallon was getting significantly worse. The carbon intensity rose from 0.39 kilograms to over 0.63 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per dollar of GDP.
Now, my initial reaction to that statistic is, I don't know, a bit of skepticism.
How so?
Well, they are an oil-producing giant. Their entire geopolitical relevance is built around hydrocarbons. Isn't a massive growing carbon footprint just the inevitable accepted cost of doing business for a petrostate? Like, of course they emit a lot of carbon.
That is a very common assumption. But it misses a crucial distinction between absolute emissions and intensity. A rising carbon intensity means their economy was actually becoming less efficient over time. Every new dollar of wealth they generated was requiring more and more carbon to produce.
Ah, so it's not just that they're making more stuff, it's that they're getting worse at making it.
Exactly. In a healthy, maturing global economy, you typically look for something called decoupling. Decoupling happens when a country's GDP goes up, but the amount of carbon needed for each new dollar goes down. This happens through, technological advancements, better energy efficiency, and a shift away from heavy manufacturing towards service industries and knowledge work.
But in this case, the data shows absolute economic growth and carbon emissions were completely coupled
Totally locked together.
and moving in the wrong direction.
They were locked together in a downward spiral of efficiency. And the reasons for this are embedded in the structure of a rentier state. When you have vast amounts of oil, governments historically heavily subsidize the cost of energy for their citizens and their domestic industries. When electricity and fuel are practically free, there is absolutely no economic incentive to be efficient.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes sense. If gas is a penny a gallon, who cares if you drive a Hummer?
Exactly. You build poorly insulated buildings because air conditioning is cheap. You build inefficient factories because the fuel to run them costs nothing. This is why the intensity was rising. They were burning an increasing amount of their own product just to achieve the same proportional economic output.
Which eventually becomes an economic Ouroboros. They are essentially eating their own tail. The cost of those emissions, whether it manifests as domestic health impacts, the impending reality of global carbon taxes, or just the sheer opportunity cost of burning your own oil instead of selling it on the open market. It starts to aggressively eat into whatever profits the country is actually making.
And that rising intensity was actively compounding the negative savings rate we discussed earlier. Making money was costing them an increasing amount of their own foundational resources.
Okay, so an inefficient, resource-draining economy is clearly a massive vulnerability. But when we cross-reference this economic data with the demographic data in our sources, this vulnerability escalates into a full-blown existential crisis.
The demographic shift is wild.
It's staggering. We are looking at a population density metric that didn't just drift upward, it exploded by a factor of 10. The density went from a very sparse 1.17 people per square kilometer to over 15.67 people per square kilometer.
Demographics are often the silent, unstoppable tectonic plates beneath macroeconomic policy. You cannot comprehend a nation's economic choices without understanding the physical reality of who lives there and how fast they're multiplying.
Let's visualize what a tenfold increase in population density actually means on the ground for you listening. When people think of this region, the outdated, romanticized mental model is often of a vast, sparsely populated desert landscape.
Right, tents and camels.
Yeah, exactly. But the data shatters that image entirely.
Yeah.
You don't take a tenfold population increase and spread it evenly across sand dunes. this society experienced a hyper-urbanization process. We are talking about a transition from a relatively spread out, low-density population to a highly concentrated society living in massive, dense metropolitan areas.
And the speed of that urbanization creates incredible pressure on the state. The most profound implication of that booming population is the creation of a massive youth bulge.
Tons of young people.
Tons. Suddenly, the state is looking at millions of young people who will be entering the workforce every single decade. Now, we have to look back at the old economic model. The traditional social contract of a wealthy petrostate works like this. The state extracts the oil, sells it globally, and uses the massive influx of cash to provide high-paying, highly secure, relatively low-effort jobs in the public sector for its citizens.
Plus all the subsidies.
Right, coupled with heavy subsidies for housing, fuel, food, and water.
It is the ultimate oil-funded welfare state.
It is. But that model is constrained by basic mathematics. It works wonderfully when you have massive oil revenues divided by a small population of a few million people.
Right.
But it mathematically cannot scale to meet the demands of a tenfold population boom. You cannot simply invent enough bureaucratic desk jobs in government ministries to employ millions of new high school and college graduates. Furthermore, the oil revenue, which is subject to volatile price swings anyway, now has to be divided among tens of millions of citizens. The math fundamentally breaks.
So the social contract of the 20th century was completely incompatible with the demographic reality of the 21st century.
Exactly.
If you have millions of young, urbanized people without meaningful employment or economic prospects, you have a recipe for profound social instability.
The demographic pressure cooker forces the state's hand. They couldn't just tweak the existing system. They desperately needed a new way to create actual, sustainable value that didn't rely on digging it out of the ground.
Confronted with this terrifying trifecta, right? Resource depletion, rising environmental inefficiency, and this crushing demographic pressure, the state realized the only way to survive was to radically upgrade the cognitive capacity of its citizens.
They had to pivot hard.
They executed a massive pivot, and the data reveals what I consider the most staggering aha moment in this entire stack of sources. When we look at the metrics for female tertiary education, which is university-level enrollment, the visual contrast is a massive shock to the system.
It's one of my favorite data points.
The gross enrollment rate for women made an astronomical leap from a virtually non-existent 0.46% to over 43.15%.
That statistic is the linchpin of their entire modern economic strategy. While a jump from under 1% to over 43% is undeniably a monumental social and cultural milestone, in the context of this macroeconomic data, we really have to analyze it through a lens of cold, hard economic survival.
Because it wasn't just done out of the goodness of their heart.
Exactly. When a country realizes it is running out of ways to generate wealth from its geography, it has to look at its demography. By educating women at this unprecedented scale, the state essentially unlocked a massive, entirely dormant cognitive reserve.
It is the equivalent of discovering a second, completely untapped oil reserve. Except this one is renewable and actually gets more valuable the more you use it.
That's exactly what it is. For decades, half of their population was effectively excluded from contributing to the formal, modern economic output. Bringing them into the fold through higher education fundamentally rewires the potential of the nation.
They basically transition from viewing their population as a liability that needed to be subsidized and managed to viewing its population as an asset that needed to be developed and deployed.
Yes, and this massive influx of education didn't just affect the female demographic, it catalyzed a shift in the entire labor structure.
The data supports that shift so clearly. We see male labor participation moving significantly as well. Employment in the service sector for men rose from roughly 62.1% to over 71.4%.
That steady climb in service sector employment is the absolute hallmark of an economy desperately trying to modernize and diversify. They are actively trying to move away from heavy industry, raw manufacturing, and extraction, which, as we discussed with the carbon intensity numbers, were becoming incredibly inefficient and costly.
Right.
And they are moving toward a knowledge-based, service-oriented economy.
It is as if the central economic planners looked at the red ink of their negative adjusted net savings, looked at the millions of young people moving to the cities, and realized the most valuable unmined resource wasn't beneath the sand, but walking around on top of it.
You beautifully said.
They began shifting from a heavy machinery economy to a human interaction economy.
And that pivot is crucial for repairing their national balance sheet. Recall the adjusted net savings formula we started with.
Yeah, the one that subtracts resource depletion.
Right. In that calculation, money spent on education is not categorized as mere consumption or government spending. It is mathematically counted as an investment in human capital. So as the state poured billions of dollars into building universities, funding scholarships, and pushing millions of men and women through higher education, they were actively counteracting the depletion of their natural resources.
They were converting finite physical capital into appreciating human capital.
Precisely.
But, and there's a big but here, the data also provides a really harsh reality check. Building universities and handing out diplomas doesn't instantly transform a country into a high-tech powerhouse. We found a deeply sobering data point that tempered the excitement of that massive education boom. The transition from a resource economy to an innovation economy is, well, it's riddled with bottlenecks.
It is notoriously difficult. Economists often refer to this struggle as the middle income trap, or in this specific context, the trap of the resource curse. Escaping it requires far more than just human capital.
Let's examine this innovation bottleneck, because despite pouring billions of dollars into education and minting all these new university graduates, the data on high-tech exports is remarkably flat and honestly kind of depressing.
It's very stubborn.
Yeah. When we look at high-tech exports as a percentage of total manufactured exports, the number hovered stubbornly at well under 1% for a very long time, like 0.66 to 0.77%, and even recently has struggled to break past the 2% mark.
That it's a stark indicator of the structural challenges they face.
This is where I have to push back on the education narrative a bit, or at least ask for deeper explanation. If you have all these highly educated people, millions of men and women entering the workforce with advanced degrees, why aren't they immediately exporting microchips, cutting-edge robotics, or complex software? Like, why is there such a massive disconnect between the massive inputs of education and the highly anemic outputs of high-tech manufacturing?
What you are observing is known as the translation gap.
Translation gap.
Yeah. You can mint university graduates by the hundreds of thousands, but human capital does not exist in a vacuum. A smart engineering graduate cannot simply walk out of a university and start producing high-value physical exports. To convert that raw intelligence into a competitive product on the global market, you need a massive, deeply complex surrounding ecosystem.
Okay, so education is just the seed. But what actually constitutes the soil?
The soil requires robust, highly funded research and development facilities. It requires rigorous intellectual property and patent laws that are actually enforced so inventors feel safe creating new technologies.
Right, so nobody steals their ideas.
Exactly. It requires a mature, aggressive venture capital network willing to take massive financial risks on unproven ideas. And perhaps most importantly, it requires deep, generational manufacturing know-how, the kind of supply chain integration you see in places like Shenzhen or Silicon Valley. Without that surrounding ecosystem, human capital simply cannot easily convert into high-tech physical exports.
And you can't just buy that ecosystem with oil money, can you? It has to grow organically.
That is the core of the resource curse trap right there. Developing an innovation ecosystem takes decades of trial and error. It requires a culture of business that is entirely different from a culture of extraction. Think about it. In an oil extraction economy, success is dictated by scale, logistics, and state monopolies.
Just moving huge pipes and ships.
Right. It is about getting massive, heavy physical things out of the ground and onto ships. Risk is minimal if you know the oil is already there. But in an innovation economy, success is driven by rapid iteration, high tolerance for failure, decentralized risk-taking, and the protection of invisible intellectual property.
That's a totally different mindset.
Completely. Moving a society from a mindset of guaranteed extraction to a mindset of risky innovation is the hardest phase of any economic transition.
So, unable to immediately compete with East Asia or the West in traditional high-tech physical manufacturing, the data suggests this nation decided to build a completely different kind of infrastructure to harness its newly educated youth.
A pivot within a pivot.
Yeah. They orchestrated a massive digital and institutional leapfrog. Because if you lack the decades of manufacturing ecosystem to export microchips, the logical pivot is to export and build services. And to do that, you need a completely different foundational architecture.
Absolutely.
The digital explosion recorded in this data set is staggering. Let's look at the proliferation of secure internet servers. This metric is effectively the backbone of a modern digital economy. I mean, you cannot run fintech startups, massive e-commerce platforms, or digital service industries without them.
Not at all.
The numbers skyrocketed from a mere 359 servers to over 17,042. That is an exponential, nearly 50-fold expansion in digital infrastructure.
Those servers are the new pipelines. Instead of pumping liquid hydrocarbons, they're pumping data. For a young, highly educated, increasingly service-oriented workforce, robust digital infrastructure is the absolute prerequisite for employment. You just can't have a human interaction economy without the bandwidth to support it.
But pouring concrete for server farms and laying fiber optic cables is still the easy part, relatively speaking. Having fast internet isn't enough to build an economy if the underlying rules of society are broken.
This is a crucial point.
And this brings us to the institutional data, which might be the most surprising and crucial metric in the entire stack. We looked at the World Bank governance metrics, specifically a metric evaluating corruption control in global percentile rankings. This metric climbed from a dismal baseline of around 5.2%, rocketing up to nearly 79%.
The improvement in corruption control is arguably more vital to their survival than the server count.
Really? More than the infrastructure itself?
Without a doubt. To build a digital service-based economy, a nation absolutely must attract foreign direct investment, and it must cultivate a vibrant, highly competitive private sector. Neither of those things will ever materialize if the rules of the game are rigged.
Because if you are a tech startup founder or an international venture capitalist, you are not going to deploy your capital into a system where contracts aren't honored.
Exactly.
You won't invest if success depends entirely on which royal family member you know, rather than the actual quality of the software you are building.
The contrast between the two economic models is really stark here. In a traditional oil economy, the state controls the single point of failure, which is the wellhead. Even if the system is deeply corrupt, even if there are massive inefficiencies and graft all around it, the oil still flows out, the global market still buys it, and the money still comes in.
The system survives its own corruption because the resource is just so inherently valuable.
Yes, but a modern knowledge economy is inherently decentralized. It relies on millions of tiny, trust-based transactions happening every single day between strangers, companies, and international partners.
You can't mandate innovation from the top down. You can only create the environment for it.
Exactly. Increasing transparency, enforcing contracts, and ruthlessly cracking down on corruption were not simply moral imperatives or public relations exercises for this country. They were absolute, non-negotiable economic prerequisites for survival.
They had to prove it.
Yes, they had to prove to the global market, and more importantly to their own educated youth, that the domestic ecosystem was safe and reliable for investment.
It represents a massive, necessary shift in the operating system of the country. And as they built up these digital and service sectors, the state also had to make some incredibly harsh, hyper-rational decisions about where to cut its losses.
Because you can't fund everything forever.
Right, you have to prioritize. And this brings us to a fascinating trade-off regarding their most precious natural resource, and surprisingly, it isn't oil.
The data reveals a story of painful but profound strategic maturity here. It involves acknowledging a geographical reality that they actually tried to ignore for decades.
When you look at the agricultural data, at first glance, it looks like a massive policy failure. Agriculture's value added to the overall GDP dropped from a historical high of nearly 5%, steadily declining down to below 2.5%.
The sector is actively shrinking.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. In almost any other context, a shrinking agricultural sector in a developing nation would be a massive red flag. You just told me their population density increased tenfold. They have millions more mouths to feed, yet they are deliberately producing less food. How does giving up your domestic food security make any economic sense?
It sounds totally counterintuitive until you examine the specific geography and hydrology of a desert nation. This completely flips our standard economic assumptions about agriculture.
Okay, how so?
Well, in most of the world, agriculture relies on renewable rainfall and flowing river systems. In this specific desert environment, massive-scale agriculture relies almost entirely on pumping ancient, irreplaceable fossil water from deep underground aquifers.
So we have to define fossil water. This isn't water that gets replenished every spring when the snow melts.
No, not at all. These aquifers took tens of thousands of years to fill during ancient, wetter climate epochs. They are a finite resource. Once you pump them empty, they are gone forever. For a long time, the government ran a heavily subsidized program to grow wheat in the desert, driven by a desire for absolute food self-sufficiency.
Which politically sounds great. We grow our own food in the desert. It's a great PR spin.
Politically, it's a great slogan. Ecologically and economically, it was suicide. Growing incredibly water-intensive crops in a harsh desert using irreplaceable fossil water was an unsustainable vanity project. It is essentially water mining.
Water mining.
They were liquidating their most critical survival resource to grow a low-value commodity that they could easily just buy on the global market.
So, the drop in agricultural GDP from 5% to 2.5% isn't a failure of their farming industry. It is a deliberate, highly managed strategic retreat.
Yes. Shrinking this sector to conserve water demonstrates a high level of long-term thinking that is honestly often rare in petrostates. The state looked at the true, hidden cost of that domestic wheat, which is the permanent destruction of their future water security, and realized it was a catastrophic trade.
So they stopped it.
They consciously chose to trade low-value domestic agricultural output for long-term ecological survival. It is infinitely cheaper to import wheat from nations with abundant rainfall than it is to run out of drinking water in a desert. This decision is a perfect example of aligning economic policy with the unforgiving reality of natural capital.
And when you take all of these painful, massive shifts together, right? That's stopping the catastrophic agricultural water subsidies, investing billions into unlocking the female cognitive reserve, building the physical infrastructure for a digital economy, and reforming the legal institutions to combat corruption, they finally start to reflect in the real bottom line.
It all comes together.
It does. And this brings us to the deep V recovery of their true wealth.
This is where the long-term strategy pays off, and where the accounting finally aligns with the physical reality of the nation's actions.
Let's circle all the way back to the very first metric we discussed, the adjusted net savings rate. We saw how it plunged into the terrifying negative numbers, hitting that negative 8% during the years of reckless oil extraction, massive environmental inefficiency, and water mining.
The dark days of the balance sheet.
Right. But the recent data in the stack shows a magnificent, deep V-shaped recovery. The curve rockets upward from those negatives, surging to a highly positive 31.76%.
That recovery is the mathematical proof that the pivot is actually working. If we remember the formula for adjusted net savings, it becomes clear why this happened.
Because the inputs changed.
Exactly. The formula treats resource depletion as a negative and human capital investment as a positive. By slowing down their relative economic reliance on pumping oil, by cutting the deeply wasteful water practices in agriculture, and by dumping massive amounts of capital into the minds of its youth through education, the nation fundamentally changed its balance sheet.
They genuinely began accumulating wealth that won't run out when the wells run dry.
Yes.
To go back to our earlier analogy, they stopped selling off the family factory to buy yachts, and they started using whatever oil revenues they had left to aggressively train their kids to become software engineers.
That sums it up perfectly. Achieving a positive 31% adjusted net savings rate means that even after accounting for the oil they still pump and the carbon they still emit, they are now creating significantly more long-term value than they are destroying. They've successfully transitioned from a state of hidden structural decline into a state of true sustainable accumulation.
It is an epic, incredibly complex journey hidden inside a stack of dry CSV files and World Bank macrometrics. And for you, listening right now, the story we've just unpacked is fundamentally about a harsh awakening.
It really is.
It is the realization that treating your geography as an ATM is a dead end. We've watched a nation undertake a massive society-wide pivot, navigating through mineral depletion, soaring carbon intensity, and the terrifying pressures of a booming population, and deliberately steering toward human capital, female education, and digital infrastructure.
It serves as a fascinating blueprint. It shows how a resource-dependent nation can attempt to actively rewrite its destiny and escape the gravity of the resource curse.
But tracing this journey leaves us with a deeply provocative question to ponder long after this deep dive ends. We have just tracked a highly centralized top-down government utilizing its massive accumulated fossil fuel wealth to forcibly, almost unilaterally, drag its entire economy into a post-carbon, knowledge-based future.
It's a massive flex of state power.
So does this data suggest that the most effective way to escape the resource curse is actually to have an incredibly powerful centralized state capable of making these harsh, rapid pivots without the friction of a slow, decentralized political system?
That's the big question.
And if that is the case, what does that mean for the rest of the developing world who are desperately trying to make this exact same leap into the knowledge economy, but without a trillion-dollar oil cushion to break their fall?
That tension between centralized power and economic modernization is arguably the multi-trillion-dollar question for the 21st century.
It really is. Thank you for coming on this deep dive into the data with us. It's been a fascinating look at how the ledger of a nation is truly balanced. Because as we've seen, measuring a nation's future isn't about looking at the fossil fuels buried underground. It's about looking at the brains they're cultivating above ground.